We're going to first take a little closer look at how we can prepare our papers. And the papers in your kit, if you purchased a kit from me, look something like this. If you want to make removing them from the flower a tiny bit easier, you can go in with a hole punch, and you don't have to be super precise. Just punch a hole right there in the middle of the paper. And when you're ready to remove them from their basting, you just take a paper clip or another long object that's not too sharp, and you're just going to go in there and pull it out. But I'm going to show you that later on. This is just preparing the papers. So that's one way you can help get your papers ready. If you are reusing your papers, they might look a little crinkly like this. That's not too bad, and they're easily freshened up by just giving them a quick press with your iron. You might want to put a little piece of fabric in between your iron and the papers, but you can freshen these up by doing that. If you have papers where the edge is eaten up, like this one, you can see the bites out of it, it's probably best to let that one go. And that probably, those bite marks are from your needle. So you might have had it in there super tight, or you were trying to stitch two hexagons together and you were biting into the fabric. I'm sorry, the paper. So those are some additional things you can do to prepare your papers. The next thing we're going to look at is ways you can prepare your fabric. So your fabric might be strips, and it might be little bits that you've collected from scraps of other projects that you want to use in your hexagons. The thing that I think helps but is not necessary is to take your fabric, spritz it with a little starch, let it sit till it's almost completely dry, and then run your iron over it. You're ironing. You're not pressing. You're just ironing, getting all that moisture out. Make sure all the moisture is out before you start cutting or using your fabric in your hexagons. That helps give a little more body to your fabric and makes turning that edge over a little bit easier. All right. A lot of the hexagon fabrics are cut with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, like this one. And that's just enough to turn your edge over and make your tacking stitch on the corner. Now for people starting out, and for all of us, if we're doing a lot of these, sometimes it's easier to have a little bigger seam allowance. And so I am providing an option where you can purchase a template and cut your own pieces of fabric with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now this is one of my templates that I have had made, and when you get it, you're going to want to remove this piece of paper on the back. That is just to keep it from getting scratched in shipping. And you'll actually see on here that it says that it's a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. You can also buy templates that are a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And if you're going to use this to cut out some hexagons, you're just going to lay it on the paper, on the fabric, and draw around the outer edge. The inner edge is there just to show you a window. And why might you want a window? Well, a window would be helpful if you want to specifically center an image, and I'm going to show you a little bit more about that later. All right, so this hexagon has been cut out using the 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. And I'm just going to hold these two up so you can see there is, you can see a difference in the size if you look carefully. It's not huge difference. That's about how much difference there is. Okay, so that just gives you a little bit more fabric to use when you're basting or tacking. And that almost looks like it's swimming on there, doesn't it? So you just use the exact same process though to get this ready. All right, so that's another thing that you can do to prepare your fabric. I've also seen people use a square of fabric, and that looks like this, and they just fold it over and tack it with all that extra fabric behind. Now this works great if you're using a little charm square packet or something. I personally don't like it as much because you have a lot of bulky fabric left on the back. I also think it's helpful, and I did talk about this in the tutorial, to really finger press that side down. Now, if that's still not enough for you, you can use a craft iron or a regular iron to press these seams down before you tack them. Be very careful. This is working with tiny pieces, and you can easily steam or burn your fingers. It's probably good to have a stiletto or some kind of implement if you're going to use an iron, if you're not using a craft iron, to press these down before you tack and baste them. Okay? Another helpful item that I found, and I hope to have in my website soon, are these little sandpaper dots. And they're meant for the back of templates so that they don't slip and slide around on the back of your fabric. And you just need to find a few places on your template. They are sticky. You can remove them, but they're not super easy to remove, but you can remove them. And I just put a few on the back to keep the template from slipping around on the fabric. And so I like to draw my shape on the back of the fabric if I can see, if I'm not worried about where it's placed. If I'm looking for a specific placement, then I usually draw it from the front. And so you can see there, and I can kind of push on this, and it moves, but it's definitely giving me a little resistance, so it'll make it easier. Because holding your fingers down on this as you draw around it can sometimes be challenging as well. Now, some people who are comfortable with a rotary cutter use a mini rotary cutter and just cut along those lines without drawing. I think if you're starting out, you want to draw that line using any kind of a marker that's not going to bleed into the fabric, and then cut it out with a pair of scissors. A pencil works great as well. Whatever you can see clearly on the back. You want to cut off the drawn line. You want to cut those markings off as almost completely if you can. Okay, let's take a look now at basting the hexagons and how we get our hexagon paper to stay in place on our fabric. So in the first part of this video, I showed you that you could use just a kiss of glue on the back of the paper. You don't want to use much because you want this to come out easily and I mean just a kiss. I mean, you can barely see the purple. That's more than enough to hold it in place. All right, so that's one option of holding it in place. Another option is to use a magnet, and you can just use a needle minder and hold it in place in the front and in the back, and do your work from there. It's not my favorite method because you've got this bulk here in the middle, but some people find it to be extremely effective. All right, what I like to use, and what I showed you in the first part of this video, is a quilter's binding clip. And before I start, I make sure to press either with finger or iron or both all those seam allowances back so that they're already trained. You know, fiber has memory, and textiles have a memory, and so if you fold them once, they will fold that way again a second time much more easily. Now, one thing I do like about the 3/8 of an inch seam allowance is that if I'm shifted a tiny bit and maybe a little bit deeper on this side, I still have plenty on the side across to get a nice seam allowance that I can grab onto. Okay, so now I've finger pressed it all, and now I'm going to start with my first seam and my first tacking stitch, and I like to put the binding clip right on that fold. And for this, I'm going to use some red thread so that you can see it. You can use any color because these stitches aren't going to show. You don't have to necessarily remove them. All right, so do you see the fold right there on the fabric? See it where it's folded? Let me take this off so you can see it again. All right, so that's the fold. That's what I'm tacking down. I'm tacking down that fold. So I'm coming up a little bit away from the fold, and I'm going to come up. So I'm coming up before the fold, and I'm going to come up after the fold. All right, and I've got a knot in my thread, and I'm going to pull it through. Okay, now that's not going to hold that in place unless I stitch backwards over that fold and hold it down with a stitch. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take the thread and the needle, and I'm going to go in where I started and come out in the same place I ended. And I'm going to end up with a stitch that's a tacking stitch that's holding down the fold. And at this point, I take out my binding clip. All right, let's move to the next one now. So I'm going to move to the next one and fold that over, and I'm going to hold it in place with the binding clip, and I'm going to go in before the fold, go under, not going through the paper, just going under, and I can feel the drag of the point of the needle against the paper, and then I'm coming up on the other side of the fold, and then I'm going to go back. I'm going to take my thread and go back and do it again in that same order: before the fold, scraping under, and then out after the fold. So I'll get my tack down. Okay, can you see that? And then we'll go to the next one, fold it down, and see how easy that is. Since it's already been folded, it's already got that memory, and it just goes right down. Okay, so before the fold, scraping under, not going through the paper, and up after the fold. And then repeating it to make our tacking stitch. And you can see these nice long pieces of thread that are just holding this in place. It's not going to flap up when you're stitching this to another hexagon. It's just going to hold it in place. All right, we go again. Go in before the fold, scrape along, go up, and then repeat. And we're getting close to the end here. We move this over, do it again. This will become second nature. You'll just be relaxing, watching a show. You can do this while you're chatting. There's no counting involved. There's no attention needed to any details, really, because most of the details have been taken care of in your prep work. Okay. All right, and then I like to do, you don't have to, but I like to complete the hexagon going all the way around and then just go back to the beginning and make another stitch. Make another tacking stitch on that first fold. Okay, and then I go in and take a couple passes through a loop there. Can you see that? Oops. To tie the knot, and I'm done. So the last thing that you do in this process, you can then press this piece so that it's nice and firm on the folds. So when you stitch it to another hexagon, it's already got its nice shape. And once your hexagon is stitched together all the way around, you can remove any papers that are completely surrounded. Okay? And so it just so happens this one has a hole in it, so I'm going to go in with my bent paper clip and just pull it out. Slip it in and pull it out. It's as easy as that. This paper's in good shape. I can press it and use it again. Now, just for teaching purposes, I'm going to show you what happens if I pull it out without it being completely surrounded. Because we've basted this nicely, it won't be a total disaster. But first of all, it's pretty hard to come out. You can see that there's no body to this, and this easily could bump out and distort the shape and the size of my hexagon. So not terrible because we have this basting, but this is not safe. This could easily be distorted. That's why we wait until it's been completely surrounded. That isn't going to change shape at all. It's protected by all those around it. After you're done putting your flower together, you can press it again, and you're going to go on to putting all these flowers together into a project or whatever you choose. I hope this helped. I hope that brought a little more clarity to the steps I showed you in the initial part of this video. And make time for stitching.